Hello and welcome to the latest Racing News 365.com podcast episode. This weekend, we're racing around the streets of Miami. Joining me to analyse round 5 of the Formula 1 calendar, I have editorial director Dieter Rencken and Asian correspondent Michael Butterworth. Dieter, I know you at the race yesterday and now you are in Fort Myers.
Correct indeed, yeah, Balve. I came down last week ahead of the race, obviously. I was fortunate enough to be invited to the Collier collection, which is an absolutely superb collection of cars, predominantly race cars, owned by Miles Collier, a big Porsche fanatic, but he'd also been friendly with guys like Briggs Cunningham, Lance Reventlow, all sort of 60s American racers. And he took over their collections, and an absolutely superb collection. But I think the best part is actually the archive stroke library. They've got something like 700,000 prints, motor-orientated, be it motoring or motorsport-orientated prints. They've got a library. I mean, they sort of said, Rencken, let me have a look. And they said, oh, you wrote for this publication back then, you wrote this. Superb stuff. So I was sort of in seventh heaven. And then from there, I went to Miami and then returned last night back to Fort Myers, which is about 200 or 150 miles northwest of Miami. And I'll fly out later on today and then get ready for Imola in less than a fortnight.
Yeah, it's coming so quick. And Michael, hello to you. I know you love your facts. So Miami, Michael, had no yellow flags, no safety cars, no virtual safety cars, no red flags, no retirements, and I believe only one error in the pit lane with signs.
Yeah, and this was the Miami Grand Prix was the 1084th Grand Prix ever since the World Championship was inaugurated in 1950. It's the 14th time that we've had no retirements, and 13 of them have been since 2005. So it just shows just how reliable the cars have got in recent years. Really quite exceptional stuff. And for all the talk that we were expecting to see safety cars and virtual safety cars and red flags at Miami, we saw on Friday and Saturday plenty of instances of drivers going backwards or running wide or going into the wall, and we didn't see anything like that on Sunday. It was all very, very ordered, and a very, very a surprisingly uneventful race from that point of view. But there was plenty of intrigue going on up and down the field, and plenty for us to dig into today.
Obviously is a sort of figure that's being bandied around officially, but we're in the US. We shouldn't forget that some of those races were actually back in the 50s. Indianapolis counts towards the World Championship, so not strictly Formula 1. In 52, we had the Formula 2 cars contesting the top series. Is that again, is it Formula 1 World Championship? So that's a lovely thing about the sport. Whatever statistic gets thrown around, there's always a counter, and we can come back and say, oh, but what about this or that or the other? And it's great. Sort of pub quiz type fodder.
Yeah, I was at the 2019 Chinese Grand Prix. They sold that as the 1000th race, so I'm going to take it from there that 1000, and I think it's 1084 was Miami.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. But as I say, they're just all these sort of various vagaries, so to speak. But yeah, you carry on, Balve. Sorry we interrupted you there, but of course we're being over enthusiastic to get the news out to our readers and listeners.
my new word is various vagaries, Dieter, which I'm going to steal from you if that's okay. So let's dig into the weekend. So Perez, let's start with him at the top team. Dieter, he had such a clean race start at the beginning.
He did indeed, but then again, I sort of felt that he didn't really consolidate that advantage. He didn't open up enough of a gap. It was a peculiar weekend for Checo, because on Saturday he said, well, this is one of the worst days of my life recently. And then, of course, he managed to get himself pole position after that Charles Leclerc thump into the barriers. And then he had the advantage at the start. But, when I spoke to Max on Saturday afternoon, I said, what can you do from ninth? And he said, minimum P2. And I sort of looked at him and I thought, well, this guy's kind of confident that he's going to be able to overtake all those cars and get close enough to Checo to potentially challenge. And, of course, he did. And I think Checo will now look back and rue that maybe at the beginning he didn't really go all out and get himself a very, very solid cushion.
Yeah, I mean, the real interest, as you said, Dieter, Verstappen starting in 9th, I think we all knew that he was going to come through the field. It was just a question of how long it would take him to get up to P2. The answer was by lap 15. He got up to P2, and by lap 15, he was only 3.5 seconds behind Perez. And if you compare the gap, Perez to Verstappen at the end of, say, lap 1, once all the cars have gone round the lap, he actually closed the gap to Perez whilst overtaking 8 cars. So Perez at the end of the race, Perez seemed really sort of deflated. It wasn't like he was managing an issue. He just seemed slower, just objectively slower than Verstappen in just about every corner of the race. And I think this is a pretty big psychological blow for Perez to be beaten like that so convincingly when he should have been the favourite, starting on pole position with that Red Bull, the advantage that we know it has over the rest of the field, and with Verstappen down in 9th place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we also look at it from a Hispanic perspective, I mean, there were Mexican flags all over the place. You know, Miami is very, very Hispanic. I think he sort of felt that he's got the home advantage, so to speak, but he frankly didn't really consolidate on that. So, as you say, I think he's a bit deflated, but equally, you know, he does go home still within striking distance of Max at the top end. And who knows what happens at the next race? You know, if Max has an issue, Checo could end up leading the championship then.
And there was such a disparity in the Red Bull cars, Dieter, with the radio going between the pit and Verstappen and the pit and Checo. What did you make of that? Because there was so much communication between Verstappen and his team, but not so much with Sergio Perez and his team.
Correct. But, you know, I think before we start looking for conspiracies and all sorts of things, I think what we should accept is that different drivers have got different approaches to their races. You know, Lewis is constantly chatting, asking this, asking that, asking the other. Fernando every now and then dispenses some assistance towards his teammate about use my brake balance or do this or do the other. Then at the other end of the scale, we had Kimi. You know, whenever they spoke to Kimi, he'd sort of famously say, "Leave me alone, I know what I'm doing." And I think different drivers have got a different approach to this. And I think you'll find generally we find the communication between Max and GP, his race engineer, is a lot more lively than with Checo and his. Checo is just not a very talkative guy. I don't think it means that the team is in any way disadvantaging him. I mean, ultimately, if Checo felt that, he could go and ask the question. Let's have a look at Jeddah. You know, there he was very, very vocal on the radio. What's the gap? You know, what lap times is Max doing, etc. So I don't think we should see conspiracies. I think it's just a matter of individual choice in a particular event.
And Alonso had such a lonely race that he started watching TV whilst racing. He said that Lance Stroll had a great overtake on turn 1. Moving on to Mercedes, Dieter. Hamilton was complaining about the W14.
He was, but then again, he's been complaining about sort of W13, W14 for the last 18 months. And I don't think that will go away until he's got a winning car. Again, is that a criticism of the team? Yes, it is a tacit criticism. But equally, it also proves that he hasn't lost that fire, that will to win. And, you know, the minute he stops complaining about it, he's complacent. And that means, you know, I don't care anymore. You know, it's over. And that's just not Lewis. I'm not surprised. The one thing that I will say, though, and I'll sort of add this in here at this point, is that for all Red Bull's domination, I do believe that teams like Ferrari, Mercedes, to a far lesser degree, Aston Martin, certainly Alpine, you know, all the people who are in the sort of top 4 or 5, or should be in the top 4 or 5, are making it very, very easy for Red Bull. And, you know, they keep saying, well, Red Bull are running away. Well, you know, all Mercedes have got to do is ask themselves why. They have got a dud car. That's why Red Bull is running away. Ferrari say they're running away. Why? Because they've got dud team management, dud strategies. When I say a dud car, certainly not a car that's up there. Charles Leclerc yesterday was very, very vocal about the Ferrari, saying it's totally inconsistent. He says in the same corner, it can go from oversteer to understeer for no reason whatsoever. At worst, it doesn't do the same every lap. So, you know, it's all very well for Lewis to go and complain. Yes, the car is substandard, but he must go and talk to his team about it and sort it out, or they must sort it out for him.
I actually thought for Hamilton and Mercedes, this was actually quite a good exercise in damage limitation, because Hamilton qualified down in 13th, especially in the early stages of the race. He struggled to make his way through the field, certainly as easily as we saw Verstappen do. He did manage to make up quite a few places towards the end. He finished in 6th. George Russell finished 4th. So Mercedes actually outscored Aston Martin by 20 points to 15, because Alonso finished 3rd. Lance Stroll had a poor race, was knocked out of qualifying early, and didn't then make it into the points in the race. So Mercedes are now just 6 points behind Aston Martin, who are second in the constructors. They've got a big upgrade planned for Imola. So maybe there are signs of something of a turning of the corner soon for the Silver Arrows.
Yeah, that's a very good point about closing up the gap, but I think that's sort of temporary. I mean, Lance did have a bad run. He wasn't in the first race, or he was injured in the first race. He wasn't in testing because of that bicycle incident. So, there are certain mitigating factors, but I think ultimately what Lewis has got to accept is that right now in the same car, the W14, George does seem to have an edge on him. So I think the first thing that Lewis should do before complaining about W14 is look at his own performance and just see whether he could up it. Not an easy car. Obviously, upping his performance won't be easy, but if George can do it, so should Lewis at, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6 times the salary.
Yeah, we saw that with Mercedes' strategy with Hamilton, Dieter letting George go past in that race.
Yeah, absolutely. But then again, I think that some of that is teamwork. Some of it is tactical, because if you know that you're on different strategies at different points, your tires are on different stuff. Why bother fighting and damage your own race? So again, Lewis certainly hasn't lost his racecraft. He may find it difficult to have speed with this particular car, but ultimately, he did move up, as Michael says. He moved up very, very well from the second half of the grid.
It was definitely interesting to see from my point of view. Dieter, you mentioned Ferrari, and I want to dig into that a little bit deeper. And it was a weekend to forget, not only in the race but also in quali as well.
Oh yeah, but I mean, Ferrari have had quite a few weekends to forget. Let's be very, very blunt and honest about this. I think that ultimately this one, in terms of forgettability, could actually be shaded by some of the others. And going forward, unless things improve, there are going to be a lot more races to forget for Ferrari. Is it the change of team principle? No, it's never that simple. Is it down to the car? No, it's never that simple. Is it down to maybe bad luck? The drivers are basically being not rewarded for a lot of the effort due to mechanical stuff, etc. But ultimately, Ferrari does need to take a very, very, very serious, hard look at itself and work out exactly where it's going. And I fear that they're not going to sort this out under this formula. And this formula goes until the end of 25. The chances of them having a rapid turnaround for 24 and 25, I think, are pretty slim. I think, once again, they're going to be writing off a full championship, and they're going to head for their previous drought, where, back in the early 2000s, it was from 79 through to 2000 before they managed to get themselves another world champion. Jody Scheckter in 79, and then of course Michael 2000. And ultimately, I think they're going to be asking themselves this question: are we heading for another 21 years? Because Kimi was the last in 2007.
And another weekend where Charles Leclerc made an unforced error. Obviously, that crash at the end of qualifying that affected everyone else's lap. That it contributed to Max Verstappen starting down in ninth place. And Leclerc only managed 7th in the race, and he was stuck behind Kevin Magnussen's Haas for what I thought was an embarrassingly long time. And it's not where Ferrari would want to be at all. The car looks quick over one lap. We saw him in Baku got pole position, but they fall back so much on the Sunday, certainly compared to Red Bull. And obviously Fred Vasseur coming in as the new team principal. Lauren Mekis, David Sanchez are either leaving or have left. So a lot of transition and a lot of change at Ferrari. And not quite sure where they go from here, to be honest.
Although it's a lot better for them than McLaren. I mean, McLaren really had a weekend to forget. Let's not forget that. Here are two teams that back in the late 90s were really going at it, hammer and tongs at each other. It's not happening. I mean, McLaren are just not even in the mix. They are down there with Williams. And, they used to be with Williams. They used to be sparring mates. But they are now, but at the wrong end of the order. If you turn the timesheets upside down, those two teams would look pretty good.
Yeah, and both cars out in Q1, Norris and Piastri. Norris qualifying 17th, Piastri 19th. And this is just one race after their much vaunted upgrade, or they were talking about 3 major upgrades over the course of the year to try to bring everything back. Zach Brown, before the action got going, he was talking about saying that the energy in the team was great. Well, if we have a bad result, then we just dust each other off and we go at it again. And I think this just proved that this first update was aimed at more at creating a stable platform to build on than actually bringing outright pace to Baku and then beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. I hear where Zach is coming from, but I think we should also cut the team some slack. They don't at the moment, for whatever reason, and let's not delve too much into history, but for whatever reason, they don't have their own wind tunnel. They don't really have an up-to-date CFD. The simulator needed, shall we say, some upgrades. Part of this is down to a lack of investment for whatever reason, probably the last 8 or 9 years. So Zach has inherited this. There are plans in place for a new wind tunnel. There are plans in place for CFD upgrades, for simulator upgrades. But the situation is that at the moment, they're actually wind tunnel testing at Toyota's wind tunnel in Cologne, which means that every time they need to send something for testing, it's got to go all the way across the channel with all the implications of Brexit and customs and, all these sort of things. And also that wind tunnel has not really been upgraded to Formula 1 spec. I was talking to one of the team people, and basically that wind tunnel was state of art back in 2006 when it was built. But it doesn't have, for example, adaptive walls. So when you have the car, what they call in yaw, which is sort of sideways on in a corner, for example, with an adaptive wind tunnel, the walls will also open and run at the same angle. So you have the airstream following the course of the car. When you have yaw, you have the car basically sideways on, but the walls are basically dead straight like that, instead of being at the angle. And so the airstream doesn't actually follow the car accurately, and this is one of the major issues they've got. I did say to them, but the Toyota sports car is being tested in that tunnel, and it's winning everything in WEC. And they said, but that is a closed-wheeler car, and we're not having the advantage around the exposed wheels and the open wheels and whatever under cornering. So let's not be too critical. Let's cut them slack until they got the new wind tunnel verified, up and running. Then let's have a look.
It's not a comfortable period, but what else do you think McLaren need to do apart from having their own wind tunnel?
Well, as I said, it's a matter of simulation. It's a matter of CFD. There were certain areas of sort of lack of investment over a period. I personally believe that it was down to McLaren Automotive being established about 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago. At that stage, money that should have been invested in the Formula 1 team was sort of invested in other facilities. They built this massive, they called it at one stage Paragon, which is indicative of the sort of scale of the building. They now call it the McLaren Technical Centre, the MTC. But, you've got all sorts of very futuristic road car production facilities in there. There's a lake which is used to cool down the wind tunnel, which again is great for road car stuff, but it's not F1 state of art. There are tunnels connecting the two different factories, so the F1 thing and the road car. I've been through there, very, very, very impressive. Cost a fortune, and that money, unfortunately, didn't end up in facilities for the race team. That's my theory. Certainly, we need to wait until they are up to speed and see what happens.
The McLaren Artura is probably my favourite road car out at the moment. So if McLaren are listening, I wouldn't mind having one. But moving on to team principals, Dieter Christian Horner, the Red Bull principal, had some interesting comments over the weekend.
He did indeed. Well, basically, a couple of things. First of all, one of them was, he's talking about turkeys and Christmas when I asked him about the new teams, because that process is now sort of drawing to an end. I believe there are 4 new teams that have thrown their hat in the ring. And, we can discuss this in greater detail next week, because the closing date of the 15th of May is drawing near. But basically, he doesn't seem to see the need for additional teams. He thinks that 10 are great. He believes that the facilities at existing circuits may not be able to accommodate more than 10 teams. My answer to that is pretty simple. Bring less trucks, bring a smaller hospitality, whatever. None of these add to the racing, whereas one or two additional teams would add to the racing. But of course, it's not his decision where the additional teams come in. That's down to F1 and the FIA, and it's certainly not my decision. So from that perspective, yes, but he was pretty vocal about this. The other thing that he was talking about was, as I said earlier on, that he does believe that the team has done their best to be where they are. But equally, he does sort of believe that maybe the other teams have not developed since last year at the rate and pace that they should have. And I think, again, our sort of criticism of Ferrari, of Mercedes, of Alpine, of McLaren, etc., sort of bears that out. I mean, they are making it very, very easy for Red Bull to sort of take 1-2s on the trot.
Dieter, you mentioned Alpine. Their CEO, Laurent Rossi, Michael, had some choice words for his team.
Yeah, he's lit something of a firecracker up Alpine's collective backside with some comments that he made, very, very critical of the performance of the team, of the car so far this year. He said, we're in a position that is not at all worthy of the resources invested, and we are very far from the final objective of the year. He called the first race in Bahrain amateurish, when Gasly was knocked out in Q1. Esteban Ocon had 3 penalties over the course of the race. Alpine had targeted being F1's 4th best team this year, closing the gap to the top 3. It's worth noting the comments that he made, he actually made them before the race, and they had a better race. They finished 8th and 9th, so it's not as high as they would like to be, but it's a double points finish in a race of no attrition. But I wonder if, we're talking about teams not really progressing as they should have done. I wonder if Laurent Rossi is casting envious glances at Aston Martin and seeing the massive step forward that they have made from last year to this year, to looking like they're being the second fastest team. And I wonder if he's thinking, well, if they can do this, why can't we? And of course, Renault, the parent company of Alpine, Renault have got a very sort of flip-flop history in Formula One. They've come into the sport, they've left again, they've come back in, they've left again, they've come back in. And I'm wondering if Rossi's comments maybe point to the fact that Renault, if they look at the investment that they're having to put in to maintain Alpine in Formula One, and they're not getting much return on that, I wonder if they're thinking about taking their ball away and playing elsewhere instead.
Well, first of all, I think he was very vocal, but equally, I do believe that the team has not sort of made the start that it should. He was asked in an interview what he thought. It was with a French publication, French TV actually. And he was just being open and honest. And, ultimately, Zach Brown should also acknowledge that his team is not where it should be. Ferrari, for example. But I think we also need to look at the structure of the Alpine team overall. Let's not forget they don't have a partner team. Ferrari have got Alfa Romeo, they have Haas. Red Bull have got AlphaTauri. Mercedes have got a whole run of them. The Aston Martin take their PU, so does McLaren take their engine. They've got to deal with Williams. So when you have a look at this, the data collection that the other teams have is 2 to 3 times as much as Renault. And, they keep saying, well, it's an advantage. We don't have to worry about customers, etc. Well, they would say that, wouldn't they? I think that if somebody like Andretti was accepted, took the power unit, took some of the bits that they could, the rear suspension, the front suspension, the whatever, and did a sort of a Haas deal, the deal similar to what Haas have got with Ferrari, I think you'll find that their fortunes would change. The other thing is, do they really have a top drawer driver pairing? I'm not convinced that for a works team, they do have the very, very best drivers available to them. Yeah, Esteban's great. Yeah, Pierre Gasly's quick. Both won races, but under rather fortunate circumstances, shall we say. Is the driver pairing really becoming of a full-on works factory team? They don't have a superstar. Equally, when you talk about their various names, they don't have superstar designers like Adrian Newey and whatever. And accordingly, until they really spend some serious money on sorting this out, I don't think that that there's much hope of them moving much beyond sort of 4th or 5th on the grid.
One of the reasons that they don't have any partner teams or any affiliated teams is because nobody wants to take the Renault power unit. We had McLaren with the Renault power unit a few years ago, and then they had it for a few years. They couldn't do much with it, and then they switched to Mercedes. So that doesn't exactly that's not exactly a ringing endorsement of the state of Renault's power unit.
Well, before that, we had Red Bull. I mean, Christian Horner was very, very vocal about the power unit. I mean, they basically severed the contract. So, all in, we're hearing that there is sort of power unit parity at the moment in terms of output and whatever else. But there must be a reason why nobody wants it. There must be a reason why nobody wants the back end of a Renault. They all want the back end of a Ferrari, they want the back end of a Mercedes, they want the back end of a Red Bull, but they don't want the back end of a Renault. And I think Rossi should ask himself that question first.
Could you imagine a scenario where Andretti just simply buy out Alpine's entry in order to get into the sport that way, if Group Renault decide they don't want to continue?
No, because that would, I would imagine, imply they also need to take over the power unit side. Renault learned in 2009 onwards, they learned that if you're only a power unit supplier, which is what they were then until 2016, that you get absolutely no kudos if your car wins because it's the team that's won, but you certainly get a hiding when you lose. So they learned from that, and also you don't get any money as a PU supplier. At all. When I say no money, of course the team pays you, but even that is regulated. But you don't get any prize money as a power unit supplier. So there'd be nothing for Renault to gain by selling the team but keeping the power unit. And I can't see why Andretti would want to go and buy a power unit. A power unit supplier, particularly one that has no customers.
Do you think the comment that Rossi made, Dieter, do you think it helps or hinders the team?
I think it depends on the psyche of the team itself. I've always believed that you do need to be hard. This is Formula 1. We're not playing Sky Electrics. We're not playing Formula 4. Right? This is Formula 1. This is world-class stuff, and they are not delivering at world-class level, without a doubt. There are others that aren't either, which is why we're criticizing them. But I think that ultimately, if anything, I would be very concerned if I were Otmar Safnauer. He is the team principal. Ultimately, they've got to ask themselves a question. Otmar, what are you doing about this? And if he can point to the fact that there's a lack of investment, a lack of customers, and if they accept that as being the reason, then it can't be changed. But equally, I'm not convinced that some stuff internally cannot be changed. And accordingly, I think they need to talk to Otmar and find out.
We have a week's break, so Dieter, Michael and I will be back in 7 days to preview the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix. We'll see you then.